Well, let's look at the context of this moment, the beginning today, well, the stalled beginning today, if you will, of an inquiry that's meant to look into delays in investigations or prosecutions of apartheid-era crimes as per the findings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which concluded its work now more than 20 years ago. Here's how we got to this inquiry. Have a look. So it was set up. This was earlier this year. Let's bring up that timeline for us to have a look at. It was set up, so basically earlier this year. It's to be chaired by the retired Constitutional Court Justice C.C. Khampepe. What you're looking at now are some of the more emotional moments from the TRC process, where the likes of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was part of the process, had broken down in tears. I was hoping we'd be able to show you the graphic, but nonetheless, these emotional scenes that we're looking at from the TRC hearings highlight the depth of the scars of that period. Let's talk further about this now with Zaid Kimmie from the Foundation for Human Rights, Executive Director there. Zaid, good to have you on the SABC. So the issue then around Advocate Semenya and his apparent conflict of interest, which has caused this postponement until late November, is it a clear-cut case of conflict of interest?
Well, we'll leave that for the Commission to decide. But as Thembi Simelane said, what is clear-cut is that from the very moment that he was appointed as evidence leader, the NPA and the Department of Justice must have been aware of his prior involvement with the prosecution's policy. Why they waited several months to bring up this issue is beyond my understanding. They had ample opportunity to raise the objection, to settle this matter, but they wait until the first day that the Commission sits, when it's about to begin its work, and now they raise objections. To me, it smacks of obstructionism.
And at issue here, just for more context for people who were not able to follow proceedings during the day, is that Advocate Semenya had worked in an advisory role for the National Prosecuting Authority, giving advice basically. I know it eventually went to court, but some of what was covered then potentially relates to what this inquiry is then tasked with finding out, right? But to what you were saying, there is an urgency, a desperation here on the part of the victims and their families to ultimately get to the bottom of what happened to these cases and why no one was jailed. So we cannot brook any further delay, can we?
Well, yes, and what we've seen today is we had on the agenda the question of whether counsel could lead their own witnesses. That was what the parties had prepared for. They had filed their papers. That was what they were all ready to argue. Instead, we have a question about whether the evidence leader is conflicted. And in order to deal with that issue, the entire process has now been postponed for 3 weeks. It's unlikely we'll see any progress this year. And if that timeline that you wanted to see earlier says that this commission was set up on the 29th of May and it was given a 6-month mandate, I hope that the commissioners themselves are applying their minds to the fact that this deadline, the 6-month deadline, is now simply will not be met. And they need to think very carefully about applying for an extension and for how long.
And if Advocate Semenya then is kept on in the process, despite what has been flagged today around his potential conflict of interest, do you think that would compromise the outcome of the Commission's work?
Well, we're going to have to trust in the commissioners to make the right decision there. I'm not going to comment on whether or not his conflict is sufficient to disqualify him. We, as the families and the FHR, have said that we're happy for other parties to argue and will abide by the Commission's decision, and we hope that they'll make the correct decision, whatever that may be.
And how deep, how bad of a scar would a positive finding regarding suspicion around a deliberate delay in prosecuting these matters or wanting to sweep them under the rug, as some families believe may have happened, how much of a dent would that be, a blemish would that be on the record of the democratic dispensation that came on the back of people who precisely wanted to see the downfall of the apartheid regime, but ultimately the families believe that many of the people who committed those atrocities may have been allowed, through some or other nefarious reason, to walk free?
I'll refer you to the preamble to our Constitution, which in part says we honor the sacrifice of those who gave their lives to bring us this democracy. That's in the preamble to our Constitution. Honoring their sacrifice means that if perpetrators have not been given amnesty, what could be more honorable than proceeding with prosecutions? The fact that that didn't happen, I think, is a blemish on our post-apartheid democracy, and it's something that ought to be rectified. It is too late in many cases for the perpetrators now to pay for their crimes. They've passed, have died, witnesses have died. But the secondary injustice, that of the democratic state, the post-apartheid state, not fulfilling its obligation, that we need answers about.
And finally, what does one more week, one more month of waiting for families, for example, in the case of the Semelanis, it's been 42 years of waiting to hear what happened to Nokuthula Simelane. What does a further delay do to those families emotionally?
The further delay is disheartening. But as Tembe Semelani said, we will wait. What we're even more disappointed in is the lack of seriousness with which the parties have taken this commission. If they had applied their minds from the very moment the commission was set up, they would have been prepared to file their papers in time, which they weren't. They would have been prepared to lodge objections if they felt those were reasonable. They didn't. And you have to ask, are they taking this inquiry seriously at all? The president instituted this commission of inquiry, and members of his government are treating it with disdain. And that, I think, is something that has to be answered as well.
Zaid Kimmie, good to talk to you from the Foundation for Human Rights, Executive Director, speaking to us on the latest delay to the start of the inquiry that's supposed to look into those delays in prosecutions, or lack of prosecution, if you will, for apartheid-era crimes based on the findings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.